He had a body that was right here. He had a body that was over here. He had a bag that was a body in there. Oh my God. Hold on, look, I ain't finished. And he got a body behind the wall.
Well, a lot of dirt back there.
For years, the house at 12,205 Imperial Avenue blended into the neighborhood like any other, but behind those walls lurked a nightmare too horrifying to imagine. On October 29, 2009, a terrified woman burst into a Cleveland police station, her neck bruised, her voice shaking. She had just escaped from that house, a house of death. When police raided the home, they uncovered something straight out of a horror movie. Bodies, stuffed in plastic bags, rotting in the basement, buried in the backyard, even lying beside the very bed where the killer slept. Anthony Sowell, a man who seemed ordinary, had been living among his victims for years. Even more chilling, the signs had been there all along. Neighbors complained about the smell. Women reported his attacks. Police walked past that house again and again. But his victims, black, homeless, struggling with addiction, were invisible. This isn't just a story about one monster. It's a story about a system that failed, a city that turned away, and the women whose voices were stolen long before their lives. Let's dive in. Anthony Sowell's story begins in the bleak streets of East Cleveland, Ohio, where he was one of 7 children raised by his mother, Claudia Gertrude Garrison. But things got even more crowded when his sister passed away, and her 7 kids moved in too. Now, you'd think this was a family just trying to survive, but inside that house, things were way darker than anyone could imagine. Claudia wasn't just strict, she was abusive, and not just in the way some tough parents are. We're talking full-blown, sadistic cruelty. According to Anthony's niece, Leona Davis, Claudia would physically torture the kids while her own children stood there and watched. One of the most disturbing incidents, Claudia made Leona strip naked in front of everyone, then beat her with electrical cords until she bled.
And so while all of this was going on, so Anthony, he wasn't somewhere hiding in a corner, was he?
No.
All right, he was actually watching this.
Yes, he was.
And unfortunately, the cycle of abuse didn't stop with Claudia. Anthony himself turned into a predator. When Leona was just 10 years old, he started her every single day for 2 years. And it wasn't just him. Claudia admitted that the other men in the house were doing the same disgusting things to her and her sisters. That home was a house of horrors, and no one was safe. But here's where things take a turn. At 18, Anthony joined the Marine Corps, and from the outside, it looked like he was turning his life around. He trained as a military electrician, spent time in the Carolinas, and by the early 80s, he was stationed overseas. He even ended up at Camp Butler in Okinawa, Japan in 1984. And while he was in the military, people saw him as a model soldier, quiet, disciplined, hardworking. He racked up commendations, a good conduct medal, and letters of appreciation. To anyone looking from the outside, he was a stand-up guy. But underneath all that structure and routine, something much darker and twisted was brewing. Something that would eventually explode in a way no one could have ever predicted. In 1989, Anthony lured a woman who was 3 months pregnant to his home. She probably thought she'd be able to leave if things felt off, but the moment she tried, Anthony made sure that wasn't happening. He tied her up, hands and feet, using a belt and a tie, shoved a rag in her mouth, and then assaulted her in the worst way imaginable. Later, when she talked to police, she said, "Choked me real hard. My body started tingling. I thought I was going to die." Somehow she managed to escape and go to the police. Now, this should have been the moment where everything stopped, where he was caught, locked up, and never given the chance to hurt anyone else. But if you know how these things go, you won't be surprised that the investigation dragged on for way too long. And while the cops took their time, Anthony carried on like nothing happened. In fact, he probably felt invincible because just a year later, he did it again. This time, he didn't even wait for the perfect setup. A woman in Cleveland invited him over, probably thinking it was just a normal night. But once he was inside, he turned on her, choked, and assaulted her, just like before. That's when the law finally caught up with him. He was arrested and charged with kidnapping, RP, and attempted RP. He ended up taking a plea deal and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. And you'd think, after all that, he'd come out a changed man, maybe even try to turn his life around. But no, Anthony Sowell wasn't the kind of man who learned lessons. If anything, his time in prison only made him worse, much worse. Now, while Anthony was still in prison, investigators were looking at other similar cases that happened around the same time. While Anthony Sowell was sitting in prison, investigators were starting to connect the dots on some eerily similar cases that had happened around the same time. The first one dated back to May 27th, 1988, 2 years before Anthony was convicted and a year before his first known victim. Rosalind Garner was was found to death in her home on Hayden Avenue in East Cleveland. Then, less than a year later, on February 27, 1989, another woman, Carmela Prater, was discovered brutally beaten in an abandoned building on First Avenue. Now, here's where things get even more unsettling. At the time of her murder, Carmela lived on Page Avenue. And guess who else lived on Page Avenue in 1989? That's right, Anthony Sowell. Just a few weeks later, on March 28, 1989, Mary Thomas was murdered in that same abandoned building where Carmela had been found. 3 women, all killed within a year, all in the same area, and all showing signs of the same violent methods: strangulation and blunt force trauma. So, did the police immediately look at Anthony? Nope. At the time, they didn't see a reason to investigate him. After all, as far as they knew, he wasn't a killer yet. His charges hadn't even been filed at that point, and by the time he was finally locked up, those 3 cases had already gone cold. Would it have been a good idea to at least question him? Absolutely, but that never happened. By the time Anthony walked out of prison in 2005, those murders were still unsolved, and let's be real, after all those years, the police had moved on to other things. It seemed like justice would never come for Rosalind, Carmela, or Mary. After his release, Anthony tried to keep a low profile, at least on the surface. He worked at a factory for a while, but when he got laid off in 2007, he started collecting unemployment, and when those benefits ran out, he scraped by selling scrap metal. Now, he had been married before and even had a daughter, but after getting out of prison, he never bothered reconnecting with his ex-wife or his child. Instead, he turned to the internet. The same year he got out, 2005, he wasted no time setting up a profile on an adult website. His bio, he described himself as 5'10" inches, 160 pounds, with a noticeable scar on his face, but it was his interests that really stood out. He claimed to be a master looking for a submissive partner to train, painting himself as fun-loving and outgoing. In reality, Anthony Sowell wasn't looking for a relationship. He was looking for his next victim, and with that, the hunt began. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came in June 2007, when one of Anthony Sowell's neighbors called City Hall, complaining about a disgusting, overpowering smell spreading through the neighborhood. The stench was so bad that she thought it had to be a dead animal, or worse, a dead person, but nobody followed up. While some people in the area were deeply concerned about what was going on, there was at least one woman who didn't seem to think much of it: Lori Frazier. If that name sounds familiar, it's because she was the niece of Cleveland Mayor Frank G. Jackson. She had started dating Anthony not long after he got out of prison and even moved in with him. And yeah, she smelled something awful. When she confronted Anthony about it, he brushed it off, saying it was just his stepmother who had health problems. And instead of pressing further, maybe because she didn't want to believe the alternative, Lori accepted his answer and stayed with him. Later, after she finally moved out, she changed her story, saying the smell must have come from Ray's sausage shop next door. In interviews, she mentioned leaving in 2007, but some reports say she was actually there until 2008. A friend of hers later confirmed that by 2008, she had stopped spending time at Anthony's house altogether. And then came December 2008. One cold night, a woman came screaming into the middle of Kinsman Road and East 116th Street, waving her arms and begging for help. She was covered in blood. Her name was Gladys Wade. She was 41 years old. Gladys frantically told police that Anthony had invited her in for a beer while she was walking to a convenience store. When she refused, he snapped. He attacked her, dragged her inside, and choked her until she blacked out. When she came to, she realized her clothes had been removed, and Anthony had his hands around her throat, trying to assault her.
Gasping for air and grabbing at his face, clawing at his face, clawing at his eyes.
Somehow, she fought her way free, ran outside, and stumbled into a nearby restaurant, begging for someone to call 911. But instead of helping, the people inside told her to go use a payphone outside, and that's when Anthony came running after her, telling people she had tried to break into his house to steal from him. Then, just like that, he turned around and strolled right back inside. Gladys, still desperate, finally spotted a police patrol car and pleaded for help. The officers called an ambulance and took her to the hospital. After getting treated, she gave a full statement to the police, but they didn't believe her. Instead, they brushed it off as a he said, she said situation. They even suggested that Gladys might have been the one trying to attack him. Still, police did go to Anthony's house on Imperial Avenue to check things out, and what they found should have been enough to arrest him on the spot. Snow tracks outside showed signs of a struggle. A bloody tissue had been tossed nearby. The steps leading up to his door smeared with blood. They detained Anthony for questioning, but just 2 days later, they let him go. No search, no deeper investigation. They handed a monster the chance to keep going, and he would. On September 22, 22, 2009, Anthony Sowell invited Latundra Billups over to his place to smoke crack. At first, everything seemed fine until it wasn't. After a few drinks, something in him snapped. He attacked her, beating, choking, and assaulting her until she blacked out. When she came to, she immediately understood the danger she was still in. She knew if she didn't think fast, she'd end up just like the others, dead. So she made him an offer, $50 in cash and a promise that she wouldn't go to the police if he just let her go. And in a shocking moment of arrogance, Anthony actually believed her. He let her walk free, thinking he had just avoided any consequences. But the moment she was out of his sight, Latundra did exactly what any sane person would. She ran to the police and reported him. This time, authorities took action. Latundra agreed to testify against him in court, and it seemed like Anthony's days as a free man were numbered. But incredibly, that still wasn't the end of his crimes. While the police were busy gathering evidence and putting together the necessary paperwork, Anthony was out here making more noise. On October 20th, less than a month later, an ambulance was called to his house after a neighbor saw something horrifying: a naked woman, either falling or being thrown from his second-story window. Paramedics arrived at the scene, and Anthony, ever the manipulator, claimed he had nothing to do with it. According to him, the woman had been high on all night and somehow accidentally fell out of the window. And as ridiculous as that sounded, there was one major problem. When the woman was taken to the hospital and questioned, she refused to say anything about what had happened inside the house. Even when he was inches away from getting caught, Anthony somehow managed to keep his victims silent. And instead of laying low, he kept on as if nothing was wrong. But maybe, by this time, he had started to sense that time was running out. Because by the time the police finally had everything in order and showed up at his door on October 29th, he was gone. Now, with more than enough reason to suspect something horrific was happening inside that house, police secured a warrant. A young officer, only 3 years into the force, was the first to step inside the decaying house. The second the door creaked open, the stench hit him like a brick wall, thick, putrid, and unbearable. Gagging, he stumbled back and vomited right on the doorstep. Inside, the darkness swallowed everything. Trash littered the floors, but that was nothing compared to the suffocating presence of death. Officers split up, one heading to the kitchen, where black garbage bags sat ominously, another cautiously opening the basement door, only to be met with a swarm of thick, black flies. The stench was so overpowering he doubled over, retching, but the real horror was in the bedroom. On the floor, a rotting corpse lay with wide, frozen eyes, flies crawling over decaying flesh. Then, a scream. Another officer had found 2 more bodies, one stuffed under a mattress, another wrapped in plastic and tossed aside like trash. As backup arrived, an officer walking past the stairs kicked something soft. When he looked down, his face drained of color. It was a human arm, stripped to the bone. The forensic team uncovered more horror. Piles of garbage bags, some gnawed open by rats, revealing rotting flesh. Inside one bag, a severed head stared back, eyes frozen in terror, hair crawling with maggots. A long iron chain was bolted to the basement wall, likely used to restrain victims. In the bedroom, a skeleton wrapped in plastic lay beneath a red-soaked mattress. This sick monster had been sleeping among his victims. A plastic container under the bed held clothes, jewelry, and wallets belonging to the missing women. In the backyard, police uncovered shallow graves. Some victims had even been buried alive. A total of 11 bodies were discovered. And as if all of that wasn't horrific enough, officers also found old videotapes, not of home movies, but documentaries on serial killers. Anthony Sowell hadn't just killed, he had studied, learned, and perfected his craft. The manhunt was swift. His face flooded the news. His name spread like wildfire. But Sowell wasn't just any fugitive. He had military training. He knew how to disappear. For 3 days, Cleveland was paralyzed with fear. Then, on Halloween night, a bar employee spotted him wandering near downtown and called the police. 15 minutes later, a SWAT team surrounded him. He remained eerily calm, denying everything. But once officers fingerprinted him, the game was up. Anthony Sowell, the butcher of Cleveland, was finally caught. But as police started naming the victims, a harsh reality set in. Most of them were women that society had forgotten. Tanya Carmichael, 52 years old, had been missing since 2008. Her mother had gone to the police, begging them to take her disappearance seriously.
She went to Warrensville. Warrensville said, she'll show up when her dope runs out.
Michelle Mason, 45, was a brilliant woman, a college graduate with a sharp mind and a bright future, but addiction had taken hold of her life, and when she vanished, no one sounded the alarm. People simply assumed she was out there somewhere, lost in the streets. Crystal Dozier, a 38-year-old mother of 7, disappeared in May 2007. Her family wasted no time reporting her missing to the police, but because she had disappeared before, authorities dismissed it. No investigation was launched. No officers were sent to look for her. Desperate for for answers, her family took matters into their own hands, putting up flyers and calling hospitals, but no help ever came. LaShonda Long was just 25 years old, the youngest of his victims. She went missing in August 2008. Her skull was found wrapped inside a bucket in Anthony's basement. There was also Tashana Culver, Kim Smith, Nancy Cobbs, Amy Hunter, Janice Webb, Talacia Fortson, and Diane Turner. The pattern was impossible to ignore. 10 of the 11 women were mothers. Many of them had been reported missing, yet their disappearances were brushed aside. Why? Because these women were black, because some of them struggled with addiction, because society didn't see them as worth saving. Anthony Sowell was hunting women that the world had already abandoned, and for years, no one cared enough to stop him. And when the truth came out, Cleveland exploded in outrage. How had the police ignored the multiple reports from women who had escaped? Why didn't they search that house sooner, despite years of neighbors complaining about the rotting stench? How many other cases had been dismissed just because the victims were black, homeless, or struggling with addiction? The victims' families demanded answers. They filed lawsuits against the city because this wasn't just about one man and his horrific crimes. This was about a system that had failed again and again until it was too late.
Anthony Sowell spent 15 years in prison. When he came out of prison, he was registered as a sex offender. Now, he registered in June of 2008. He was supposed to report to his probation officer in September. He did not report to his probation officer. Now, that is timely, is very important, because from that June until September, when he did not report, is when all this activity was going on.
On a July morning in 2011, a crowd gathered outside the Cuyahoga County Courthouse. They held up photos of the victims, signs demanding justice, and stood in grief and anger. Inside, Anthony Sowell, who was now referred to as the Imperial Avenue Strangler, entered the courtroom in an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands tightly cuffed. But despite facing his horrific crimes, he looked completely unfazed. No fear, no remorse. His calm, almost arrogant demeanor sent shivers through the room. As he scanned the crowd, it was as if he still thought he was in control. The prosecutor opened with a chilling statement. Then, images from his house of horrors flashed across a large screen. A thick silence filled the room. The stench of death, the black garbage bags, the bodies buried in the basement. It was all there for everyone to see. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Sobs echoed throughout the courtroom, not just for the victims, but for an entire city that had failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens.
And when he started choking me, tears started coming out my eyes. And he said, you could be the next crackhead dead bitch in the street and would nobody give a about you.
It's strangling me, telling me, bitch, you can scream all you want, you finna die.
Then, it was Anthony's turn to speak.
The only thing I want to say is that I'm sorry. I know that might not sound like much, but I truly am sorry from the bottom of my heart. This is not typical of me. I don't know what happened, I can't explain it. But I know it's not a lot, but that's all I can give you.
Empty words, hollow and meaningless. No one in that courtroom was buying it, not the jury, not the victims' families. His so-called apology did nothing to erase the horror of what he had done. After weeks of trial, he was convicted on 82 counts, including murder, kidnapping, and of corpses. Then came the final blow. The judge sentenced him to death. The courtroom exploded in emotion. Some families embraced, crying tears of relief. Justice had finally been served. But for others, it was too late. Anthony never faced execution. Instead, he spent years filing appeals to delay his death. Then, on February 8th, 2021, he died in prison from an unspecified terminal illness.
Convicted Cleveland serial killer Anthony Sowell has died. The Ohio Department of Correction told us he entered the end-of-life care unit January 21st for a terminal illness not related to COVID-19, they say. He died yesterday. In 2011, a judge sentenced him to death for killing 11 women.
I think that he's probably in hell running from the devil now.
So, what's your take on this case? Do you think these women could have been saved if the police had actually done their jobs? If someone had just listened? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. And if you thought this story was disturbing, trust me, there's more where that came from. Check out our other videos for more jaw-dropping cases. Oh, and don't forget, like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss what's coming next.